remember, and what I remember of it is very blank. And it was then, as we went back to 1983, when we arrived at 1983, suddenly all of our memories of the Philadelphia experiment and what we had just gone through were back, with largely a blank out of the 2137 and the 28th century phenomena. That did come back to some extent, but it came back later. And of course, in terms of alveolic, it took a long time to get that back. But that was largely blanked out, but not totally blanked out. A little of it came filtering through after the sequence of returning to the Eldridge, destroying the equipment, because what they gave us instructions, of course, as I've covered from von Neumann, destroy the equipment, whatever you have to do, to shut it off.
Let's go back now to Montauk, because that's where you landed.
Right.
Right. Both you and your brother landed there.
Right.
And you said there's a helicopter.
Helicopter overhead with a blinding searchlight.
Right. And okay, so they took you down in the underground caverns?
They took us down the underground part of Montauk, which had been built as part of Montauk specifically. In other words, they didn't go into a cavern section. We went into a artificially built section, which was where much of the work was done. A little lower was the caverns. We didn't go that far down.
So they were expecting you?
Norman was expecting us because of the records from my report to him in 1943 of what had happened, that I'd gone into the future, and had been at the 1983 end of it. I told him all of that. He didn't really believe me, but sort of half believed me. But he said later, we're going to have to do something to prove this. But he had the records of what final report he wrote, so he knew what was probably going to happen. So quite literally, he was kept on the station as a consultant until this era would happen, if it was going to happen. Other people going through the years in 1981, 82, 83 weren't quite sure whether something like this was really going to happen.
But they still had a greeting party ready for you.
Oh yes, they had a party ready for us in case we arrived, which we did. And of course then we met von Neumann, and von Neumann told us the problem and so forth, and then of course we were shipped back to the Eldridge.
Well, let's go back, because we haven't really explored this one part.
Okay.
Here it is. You see Dr. von Neumann. He's quite a bit older.
Quite a bit, 40 years older.
Than when you left.
Yes.
What was the shock that you experienced? And when here he is, you see him.
At first, I would say at first there was no shock because we didn't recognize him. And when he said, I am Dr. John von Neumann, the same one you knew in 1943, except I'm 40 years older, and you're at Montauk, Long Island, we didn't believe him. We told him, he says, you can't be. He said, well, I am, and he was insistent on it. And he says, never mind, come with me. So he gave us the cook's tour of the underground, or the computers, and all of the various electronic systems, none of which existed in 43. And we were, shall we say, ogle-eyed at this stuff. And computers, people were talking about computers in 1943, and that's all they were doing, about what was going to happen after the war. We were going to have to do some entirely new computing techniques. They did have the analog computer at Harvard functional in 1943. They had some other calculating devices which were at the University of Pennsylvania in Philadelphia, which were not computers, but they were calculators, very large electronic calculators, and they knew the day was coming for a computer which could do the computations automatically, but it was not there yet. But then we were confronted with it in 1983, and we see all these computers. And
were these IBM computers?
Yes, IBM 360s and 370s, plus the hard drives, plus the tape drives, plus everything else. Well, we even had a couple of card readers there, and all of the associated hardware feeding those computers, other computers feeding them, and of course the graphic displays they used. And of course, after we got through all of that and some of the modern electronic equipment, a tour of the basement.
See, the interesting thing about that is that was the present state of technology
at
for
1983.
Everybody. Yeah, 1983, because I know IBM had just, I think 84, announced the successor, which was the 4300 series.
Yeah, it came just a little later.
But you would think that they would have had perhaps even more advanced technology there.
They apparently didn't. Apparently they didn't in '83. An independent group had already split off from IBM, was working on the Cray computer that became a separate corporation, of course, very large.
Seymour Cray did that, right?
Yeah, and he was originally, I believe, an IBM employee, and his whole crew that went with him. And they did have a Cray 1 installed at Montauk prior to '83, I think about 78, 79. That was the first of a long series. The Cray 2 didn't come along until after '83, as I remember. We did not have a Cray 2 on board. If we'd had a Cray 5 available, they wouldn't have had a problem. But we didn't.
Okay, so
They showed us all
in
this.
a room? Did they keep you in a room for a while, though?
They kept us in that room for a while, and we sort of looked at the equipment and so forth. Then they took us out to see other electronic equipment. They showed us... They did not show, if I remember correctly, they didn't show us the tunnel, not at first. They did later. I mean, in the first tour, there was a second tour later. But the first tour, they didn't show us the tunnel, but they showed us some of the hardware that went along with generating the tunnel. Some of the very high-powered equipment in the basement, as it were, the huge transformer, the huge ampletrons, and a lot of the other heavy equipment.
Al, why do you
switching gear.
Why do you think they gave you the Cook's tour?
To convince us, I believe, that we were in 1983 and not in 1943, and it was not a trick, and not an illusion.
Okay, and why was it important to convince you?
I suppose one could take a number of tacks on that. They had to convince us that it was real and not illusion, so that we would think we're in some kind of a nightmare or a dream, and say, oh, no, this isn't real, and refuse to cooperate any further, because they needed our cooperation desperately.
Okay.
So eventually we were convinced, but the thing that finally convinced us was sitting down in front of large screen color TV, which of course did not exist in '43. All we had is 10-inch black and white at that time, and there were other larger experimental systems, but no color. And there we were watching color TV, and everything from the Man in the Moon to the Cold War to freeway traffic and jams in the big cities, and the status of the Cold War. Cold War, what's that? Well, we listened and watched, and we said, this doesn't fit like anything we know. And then, of course, the commercials. And the commercials are what really did it. Particularly the one, which I still think was American Airlines. It could have been any one of them. Announcing, or throwing it out into the audience, as they do in some of these commercials, on your next vacation trip to Hawaii, why not fly with us on our 747 jet? And then, of course, they show a picture of a 747 jet in flight. We look at this thing and say, huh? What's that?
I can see your jaws dropping.
Because, obviously, 747 jets or anything like it didn't exist in '43.
That's right.
The Germans had jets for the military, which they had just barely put into production, though the production versions of the Me-263, I think it was. Then there was the rocket plane, which was yet to appear in '43, but the Germans had early jets, but we had no commercial jets of any kind in 1943. No one did. So here we are suddenly introduced to a world of commercial jets. So we look at each other and says, it looks like the old man is telling it straight. So we went down to his office, looked him up, and said, okay, gentlemen, are you convinced? I said, yeah, I guess we are. He says, well, we've got a problem, and we need your help. I said, okay, what's that? He says, well, as you probably gather by now, the Eldridge is pulled out of its normal space-time location by interlocking with the Montauk project, and it's in hyperspace. And it's an artificial area, and this hyperspace bubble it's generating is getting bigger all the time, and we don't know how large it's going to get. We don't know how long the equipment will stay on, as theoretically it could run for 30 days until the fuel runs out on the diesels. But nothing breaks down, it can run that long, and this bubble might get big enough to engulf the whole planet. He says, you got to go back and shut the equipment off. I says, oh great. And it's, how are we supposed to get back there? We don't even know how we got here.
Yeah, it's interesting though. Was it important that you and Duncan both
yes,
go back?
It's important that we both go back.
They couldn't just send somebody else?
No, it had to be us. And we didn't understand the reasoning at that point. I think von Neumann knew the reason very well. We were already part of a time loop, and we had to close it.
Okay.
So I said, well, how are we going to get there? He says, that's no problem. MONTAUK here, with the equipment we have complete control and mastery over space and time. We can send you any place we want at any time we want. Well, that was rather a mouthful to swallow, that they could do all of that, but they did. They gave us a tour before we were sent back. We did go up on the surface once. We did see the, shall we say, the MONTAUK tunnel hardware and the point where the tunnel would manifest. It wasn't on then.
I'm gonna throw a little curveball at you right now, and then we'll get right back to that. But
okay.
If they had that ability to send you any place, any time, why couldn't they have gone to, say, the year 2000 and pulled out some nice fancy computer hardware and brought it back and used that instead of the IBM 360s?
Well, they did change them, but the point we could make there is, yes, why not? As a matter of fact, those type of techniques were used by the United States to win World War II. Mm-hmm. A very special hardware was brought in at the time of the war with Nazi Germany, because Nazi Germany was winning over us hands down.
So you think we actually did do it?
I have this on hard information.
That's interesting. We took future technology, brought it into the present, and used it to win the war. And
also certain technical equipments, i.e. special tube receivers, were designed and built in the 80s, not the 80s, in the 70s by Preston Nichols, who was an RF expert. Told to meet these specs. It had to be built with tubes of a vintage of 1941, 42, 43. He says, why? He says, don't ask questions, just do it. So we did. After it was tested, the piece of equipment had to go through certain specs and tests and so forth. Everything's okay. He says, all right, it's ready. But before he turned it over to his boss, he says, I don't know what's going on here, but it's something very strange. I'm putting a little piece of paper with my name and date on it inside of each one of the IF coils before I seal them up finally with their lids on them and all of this. And then they can have the receiver. We'll just wait and see what happens. I know this is a little bit of an aside, but I told him about some of these things, and he says, yes, I know. He says, one of the strange things that happened in my years of traveling around as an electronic surplus dealer and going into all these swap meets, he says, along about 79, at one of the meets up in New Hampshire, I saw a receiver that looked familiar. And he went up to it and looked at it, and he said, to the guy who got it for sale, I said, where'd you get this? He says, oh, it's a standard piece of surplus equipment. And he said, the nomenclature for the nameplate for the manufacturer and the date of manufacture, the model number, all of this stuff, the whole serial numbers for the military was all on it. He looked at it and says, I think I've seen this receiver before. How much you want for it? And told him, he said, I'll buy it. He took it home, and he says to me later, he says, I swore when I saw it that was the receiver I had worked on a couple of years prior in AIL in the lab and built. And it had a manufacturing date on it of 1940, with a nomenclature and nameplates for 1940 by one of the well-known manufacturers for that year. And he opens the thing up, takes the IF coil lids off, and looks down in the coils, little pieces of paper, and then pulls them out, and there's his name, and there's the date. Wow. From about 1978, 79, whatever it was. And a receiver which was manufactured in 1940, supposedly. Now, obviously, the model must have been sent back, it had to be sent back to the people who built it in 1940. Now, why this commerce back and forth, I don't know. But there are other examples I recited that we literally took various materials out of the future in order to beat Hitler and beat Japan.
So you think if we did not do that, we would have lost the war?
That's the info I have, yes. Hitler was head and shoulders above us until we started feeding in certain specialized hardware and, of course, found the means to build more powerful aircraft in far greater numbers than he could possibly handle. Because we were sending 1,500 numbers of bombers in one fleet over Germany, bombing the hell out of them day and night. And there's no way the fighter craft they had, no matter how many they had, could handle wave after wave of that size.
It was amazing how quickly it was designed and built.
Yes, it was. It begs another question, how were we able to design